Welcome to the Dance Centre podcast. I am your host, Claire French, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, also known as Vancouver, Canada. I'll be talking to dancers, choreographers and other members of the dance world here on the West Coast to find out more about their creative work and practices, and to discuss what it means to us to be dance professionals today. Thanks for joining us. Today, I'm speaking with Angela Conquet, who is the international guest curator for the 2021 edition of Dance in Vancouver, the Dance Centre's biennial West Coast dance platform. Angela is based in Melbourne, Australia, and has a 20-year international career between Europe, Japan, Australia, and now with us in Canada. Welcome, thank you for being here. And Starr Muranko, who's co-curator with Michelle Olsen, both of Vancouver's Raven Spirit Dance Company. They have developed in Digitive in tandem with DIV. And that has been happening for several years. Starr is based in Vancouver and celebrates her mixed ancestry of Cree, Moose Cree First Nation. I think I said that right, French and German. There's a lot to talk about with my guests today, but I think what will happen is we'll reveal more about their associations with Vancouver and the world as we move forward in our conversation. And what I thought we'd do today is just start with the idea of what the crossovers and boundaries are in your perceptions between the two of you of Indigitive and DIV 2021. And yeah, so really the crossovers and maybe the boundaries launching into something. I feel like launching into this at this stage is also a way that we can address the programming and where you are at with that. But just, I also feel like Indigitive has a life and has been, I think, in several iterations now through the Dance in Vancouver, but I particularly feel that this year there's much more of a co-curation attitude, and that's also been in the program and the curation. And I wonder if maybe Angela could maybe start talking about that from her perspective, and then Starr, maybe you could pick up and just let this be a conversation back and forth, if we can handle that on our Zencaster platform.
Thank you, Claire, for inviting me to chat with you today. And as it is customary in Australia, I would like to start by acknowledging that I speak from the Indigenous lands of Australia, lands that have always been and will always be Indigenous, and to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land here in Melbourne, also known as Naarm, so the Kulin Nation and the Wurundjeri people, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, future, and their knowledges and leadership and inspiration. To answer your question, I would say simply there's no crossover and there are no boundaries this time between DIV and Indigitive. DIV is Indigitive, and that's how we worked with this premise from the very beginning, simply because I think the invitation was extended to me in such a way that it was about connecting with Starr and Michelle as co-curators of Indigitive. But coming from Australia, for me, it was an evidence that it was just part of the modus operandi that I could not imagine walking on these lands from afar, even digitally, without being guided by Michelle and Starr, and without having them work with me and support me in imagining this edition at the same level of engagement. So I think we can speak in this instance about trio, a curatorial trio, or curatorium. I don't know what the word could be. We can talk about that at a different time, perhaps. But it's been that kind of journeying together and working together from the very beginning. And hopefully that will be obvious for the audiences when they get to see what we have been busy with.
Excellent. Starr, would you like to add to this, maybe from your experience of how much it's become as Angela is talking this year, not necessarily compared to other years, but just from your place?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again for the invitation to have this conversation. I'd also like to acknowledge I'm here in North Vancouver today, and I'm in beautiful Coast Salish territory. And this is the traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in North Vancouver. And I have been a part of Indigitive since we first proposed this to Myrna and Raquel at the Dance Centre in 2015 or perhaps earlier, but it's definitely been a few editions now. So it's been several years. And I think that it has always been quite a dynamic process. And Michelle and I have really looked at it as how can we engage with the Dance Centre? How can we create space for Indigenous artists, for their work, for our processes, for relationship building with presenters? And it's looked different over many years, and it's changed every couple of years. And so this time, with the invitation to work with Angela in this way, very early on, we knew that this would be different in the sense that we're in the times of COVID and we were going to be doing things different anyways. And Michelle and I, when we thought about Indigitive for this 2021 edition, and this was even before I think that Angela was invited to be a part of it, we just really felt that we wanted to be a part of the conversations earlier on in the process. So very often we would sort of join later in the process, and we would have Indigitive be a part of Dance in Vancouver, but not necessarily be there at the beginning of the conversations. And so I think that was actually had a larger impact than even Michelle and I thought. And, being a part of those conversations from now almost a year now with Angela. And because we've been able to be meeting on Zoom and just had really almost, I would say right from the beginning, just a lot of shared values, a lot of shared interests and ideas for this Dance in Vancouver. We started meeting every couple weeks by Zoom, and I don't think we've missed very many weeks in between, ever since last Christmas, I think it was. And so we've really had a lot of conversations, a lot of time to process ideas and consider different ways of approaching this Dance in Vancouver. And we've talked a lot about legacy building too. And this is, what is it not only for this Dance in Vancouver, but what are we leaving for future Dance in Vancouvers? And that's very much, I would say, an offer that Michelle and I put forward from an Indigenous perspective, is always looking ahead to what are you leaving for future generations, and what are we learning from the past and those who've gone before us, and then what are we leaving for those who will come after us. And so I feel like, I think that at the core of this Dance in Vancouver and this co-curation has been relationship, and the relationship that the three of us have built, which has taken time and commitment and deep listening, I think, from all of us, and understanding. And we hope that that's something that we will bring into the experience for audience members and presenters and artists, I feel that it's a bit more spaciousness this time around. We're slowing down a little bit.
Yeah, I would like to say about it just being on the periphery of the organization of this, and having been working at the Dance Centre during COVID, and I'm not there now in a full-time capacity or anything, but I have to say that I've been very aware of the significance of conversation in this DIV far more than others. And I think that's evolved. It's continued in the way that I've heard Angela engage with artists in the community, as well as your organizing, and your curating conversations. And I just want to say that I really feel like this year will be different because of that, because the artists also have a different relationship to DIV because of the way that they've been part of the journey. And I feel like journey is a big word, because I also know from your writing, or I feel like that's been in your conversation about how you want the audience to experience it as a journey with artists, or the artists be on a journey with you for the audience, or like all of these different journeyings that are happening that I think are really important, because it leads me to this idea of, I read somewhere, Starr, I think it might be on Raven Spirit Dance's website, but this idea, or maybe it was you, Angela, in your wonderful lengthy article through the Japanese Foundation or something. It was beautiful. Both were really good sources for me to go to for where this idea of learning and conversation exists for both of you in different ways, and obviously all three of you. But as I'm talking to Starr and Angela now, I'm speaking for Michelle, which I shouldn't be doing. But based on this information, there's a kind of this idea of the learning circle, or a circle that's underneath this more confrontational kind of attitude of like presenter, show, audience, show, performer, production, the performer is doing this for the audience. The presenter is coming to see an artist put themselves on stage. An audience is coming to see a show. And I feel like you're getting to what's underneath all of that. One, what supports that as an industry, but then also what the value is of the work that you do to get there, and then what it means after the show is over to a certain extent. So I feel very strongly that is what's driving DIV. And I don't want to say Indicative DIV, but I feel like I should say Indicative 2021, just to kind of really make it clear that is what's happening this year. And also in relation to the pandemic, I think what's been fascinating and what I think you two have illuminated is the positive side of the exchanges that we've been able to have through technology and through rethinking how we might present or how we might engage with each other, how we might engage with our art form as well, and then how that might kind of spill out, transmit, kind of disperse to the people that we're inviting into the room with us. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the conversations influenced the curating, whether you see them as the same thing. And as this is this will be kind of going out around the time of DIV, maybe we could hint a little bit at how we want the audiences and other artists who are attending these things and might have different expectations, how we might want them to engage.
I would just like to bounce off something that Starr has said earlier. And I think, Claire, you summarized beautifully, I guess, what carried us forward or how we were bodying forth in preparing this edition. I think this the spaciousness that Starr was talking about also comes from the fact that we knew that we were working in unusual times, and very often, or I think I would say quite a lot, this is going to be an unusual edition for unusual times, or kind of business as unusual. So that terrain where we were working outside in many ways of the pressure to deliver something that would resemble previous editions or to respond to those expectations offered a lot of space. Secondly, I think this way of engaging through digital screens and digitality, also particularly in my case, because I'm arriving from elsewhere, there is already something that's deliciously challenging in being invited to be a guest curator, and yet there's something that is akin to imposture in many ways, because yes, I'm invited to be an outside eye or a critical commentator and to make decisions or make assessments about a dance community of which obviously I know very little about, and to identify those artists or those ideas which might interest not only local audiences but also international presenters. So in that sense, it's a position where I see a lot of responsibility but also accountability, and also, on a more positive note, an invitation that is extended to me to meet the artists, connect and understand. And through Zooming very regularly, what this pandemic has done, and it's probably where its potential lies, if we are to talk about a few positive aspects about this pandemic, is it really forced an enhanced awareness of how I'm listening, or how we're chatting and exposing ideas. And I think it's what we owe each other in this medium of, we're not together. I have this anecdote. Starr will probably laugh because she doesn't know, but I was watching the trailer of a show that premiered last week. And as I was watching it, it's the first time I saw Starr in her as a full body. And I thought, would have not, there's something about the way she moved that completely matched my imagination, and yet in her physicality there was something that was not what I expected. So I thought it's interesting because we have become these heads on shoulders, and yet I feel like I had this amazing conversations and this depth of engagement with both Michelle and Starr that was made possible because we were, focusing on each other's eyes and faces, and this ongoing. There was something that was very sharp in the concentration and listening that it invited. And perhaps to also go back to what you were saying a bit earlier, Clay. Yes, I think we started from the very beginning with acknowledging that there are many things that need to change in the way our communities work, in the relationship between presenters and artists, not necessarily in the relationship between artists, presenters with audiences, but just in this coming together between presenters and artists. I guess the commodification of dance as a product, and this whole, the pressure of touring and everything that actually makes the ecology, but also, I guess, the economies of dance that actually, in the long run, have perverted, I guess, some of the fundamental things that should unite us. And the first thing would be to say that we presenters, whatever word we put on who we are or the role we have, we are at the service of the artist. And, we would be out of job if artists would not have something to present. But we're also, I wouldn't say the gatekeepers, but we are the connectors to visibility between their artworks and audiences. So I feel that we owe them attention and focus and intention. And to extend an invitation with care and with, I think the word is care. It is used a lot these days. So for me, it was extremely reassuring to be guided in these conversations by Michelle and Starr, because they told me a lot about the artists and the community and what's important, what needs to transmit or what needs to be seen in this, not necessarily artists specifically, but what is important right now in this moment in time. Had I not had those conversations, probably would have taken me a much longer time. And I guess what for me was really quite rewarding was to have the opportunity to be given carte blanche. I mean, 3 of us, to imagine whatever we wanted with this edition. There was absolutely no pressure from Dance Center. There was no guiding parameters. So we really, we realized we worked with big ideas or big philosophies, but then we were able to, or we were given the space to be ambitious enough to actually translate those ideas and values into what hopefully you will be seeing in less than a month. And I wonder, had it not been for this content, had it not been for this context, I wonder if, if I had come to Vancouver, I don't know, like twice maybe before November, would we have had the same attention or the same focus? I don't know.
I was just going to add to what Angela shared, is that I remember early on a conversation the 3 of us had was, what is really I think we just said it pretty bluntly. What is the point of gathering together? What is the point of doing any of this anymore? And we were in that place of when you strip it all down, and I think we use the words too, when the spectacle is gone and we can't even be physically together, and it's not about the big performance show. What is there left that's important to still come together for, and to not to give ourselves the space to maybe reflect for a moment on what has been lost or what has changed or what has been revealed or what has been transformed, all of those things. And our hope is that when you asked Claire if the programming was a reflection of the conversations, I think it is a direct reflection of all the conversations we've had over this past year, not only with the 3 of us, but just in our own communities and with the artists and with the community in Vancouver. And, and often we would talk about what was happening in Australia and what was happening in Canada and, the similarities and across all the different oceans. And so I feel like it is a reflection. It's my hope is it's going to be almost like a time capsule of 2021, what was happening in November 2021 in Vancouver in dance, and that this will be an honest expression and reflection of that through the artists and the presenters and the audiences that come, and we'll have this shared experience, which will look different than it has in the past, but we're all different too now. The world is
exactly. And I feel like gathering is the value, and however we find ways to do that gives us purpose. But then also there's something about who is curating this and co-curating this, and the wealth of experience and insight that comes from programming and presenting and talking with people about these things. And that is a time also for you as co-curators to be reflecting and bringing those reflections to the programming. So there's something really quite, rich, obviously, about it. But in terms of allowing that, I think he said, I'm not sure who said it, but slowing down. I think Angela said there's a little bit of like slowing down and being okay with that, and realizing that out of that, there is something that can resonate with more people, in a sense, in that because we're all so much, instead of it being about our differences, it's also very much about how we have all coped, or our coping strategies, which might be different in the same circumstances. So there's something that's brought us together, but we're not being mandated or pushed. Well, we are in some ways, but we're not, DIV isn't saying this is the mandate, we're keeping this going the same, that we've always done it, despite the situation. There's all of this information that we can all, if we accept that we're gathering, we can all get something out of that. And that's an interesting space, I think.
I think we did speak a lot about rituals. Of what dance does is really about 2 important things. It's really rituals of coming together and also witnessing. And I think that's something, these are the 2, I guess, active verbs, I would say, that we use quite a lot. And I think we talk a lot, I think, in our field about the institution and what, whether in resistance or in resonance to the institution, what it can do or what it undoes very often. And I think this is a great example of what is possible where, this institution, which is Dance Center, obviously extends an invitation like this, and we are able to unfold this journey. We keep saying, but it is something that we truly hope will be experienced as a journey, and to also reinvent all the mechanisms temporarily of what brings us together or how we operate in this field. So we've tried to bring to the heart of this what is inspiring in Indigenous knowledges, whether it's First Nations peoples in Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. But I think what we centered our, I would say, vision or ambition for this edition was a few very basic things. We're going to work with circles in whichever way you want to imagine that. Just imagine a circle, like including imagination. If imagination could be a bit spherical, I mean, the Stoics imagined that the imagination was spherical. Indigenous peoples have been saying that for forever, and correct me if I'm wrong, Starr. But, so circles, interrelations, interconnectivity, the fact that, listening and hearing are two different things, the fact that, you shift how a sitting bank is positioned in front of a dancing body, it shifts completely the perspective. So we talked a lot about shifting the gaze, not because what was happening before was not right, but utilizing this moment in time, which is a civilizational crisis, really, in just pondering for 2 minutes on what can change, what needs to change, what can we change. And I think this word change has been very often worked with and through, because there are many things that we are getting wrong in how we presenters extend invitations to the artists, how the space we offer, we open or we do not open. And I think our role is really to be, Belgian famous colleague of mine said it beautifully, we're hyphens. So in that in-between space, there's so much potential, and we just need to open that space with how we open the space, and the conditions around it and supporting it, define the experience of the audience, but also the relationship that carries us forward. So again, I come back to this notion of responsibility and what we owe the artists. And I think we just wanted to be mindful of this challenging moment in time that really deeply affects what I think is the DNA of dance. It's about movement, touch and breath. Without breath, there is no movement. All the corporeality of this art form was completely denied. You can take a body online. It's beautiful, but it's not really what it is about. So then how do we work with what we have left, and what imagination might it prompt to move forward if anything might change in the near future, such as touring, especially if we talk about a newly acquired eco-consciousness that we are all now kind of faced with. Mm-hmm. What kind of relationships then will that trigger in, between artists or presenters, and also access to other audiences? What does it mean to be local, or what does locality means, or localness? In my role as a guest curator, obviously I had to imagine works that might be interesting for other audiences at other parts of the world. Well, what if we can't travel as before, and probably we won't? Or what if the whole world then goes back to normal and we continue to tour as we used to tour, with artists coming in, staying for 2 seconds somewhere and then going back, and there's no connection with local audiences? What does it say about this art form, which is really so much about connection and so much about situating an embodied knowledge and translocating somewhere else and sharing it with an audience? If all these very subtle shifts or subtle chemistries cannot operate anymore, what do we do? So I feel like that our conversations have always had this moment of, let's try all this out right now in this present moment, but there was this sort of, we are projecting something for the future as an invitation to perhaps think differently or work differently, whether curatorially, artistically, or simply in the kind of invitation that it is possible to extend to audiences.
Yeah, I feel like there's something around like the idea of listening to understand, or listening to engage. Listening as a form of engagement and as a form of embodiment is a possible place that audiences can begin to kind of attend to more in how they attend to dance, and also potentially have that as part of going forward in the future. How an audience might come to understand is by observing as a kind of, or looking as listening is something I like to, in my research, they talk about this idea of that's a degree. There are so many degrees of embodiment, and there's and so many degrees of engagement. And I think you're opening up that space that's where the space is to have these kinds of questions that I think are the start of something and the start of how to engage differently with presenters, where presenters can engage differently with their audiences potentially.
Yeah, I think that it's reminding me too just about how I feel as within our art form as artists, this is the pandemic's been going on long enough now that, we're 18 months into it, that we have, I think, adapted to many things, and we are, in a very different place than we were at the beginning, where it was, I think quite quickly we just put stuff online, without really knowing what that meant. And I think over this past year and a half, we've had some time to consider what it means to have our bodies in a digital space when we're sharing that space. How do we share it? When is it live? When is it streamed or recorded? All those questions that we didn't have to really think about before as dance artists. And now we've had to. And I think going forward, as Angela has said, like we're going to be thinking about that, what is performance going to look like? What is touring going to look like? What is this hybrid that might be possible now? As I feel like it's, rather than replacing live performance, I feel like it's enhancing the possibilities of different conversations or different ways of viewing the work, different ways in, and over the last year and a half, I've really loved a lot of the artist conversations that have happened in the dance world and theater world. And, particularly for dancers, I don't think we've spent a lot of time really having those conversations about our art. Really, we do a show and we rehearse for a very long time and we put up a show and then we're on to the next. And I feel like this time has given us, the opportunity to think about that. And I'm excited that at Dance in Vancouver this year that we're going to have all of those different elements of the programming. So it won't be shows online or shows in person, but there'll be all the rich conversations around it, or all of the different ways into the pieces and into the work, that I think is going to just make it a much more embodied and rich experience for people too. So that's something that's a surprise for me, because I think there was a bit of a judgment maybe on my part, prior to the pandemic, where it was just that if it was online, it was going to be less than the live performance. But I actually feel that although the live performance is so amazing and can never be replaced, there is something that we can consider in a digital space and in conversations. So I feel like that part's exciting to me, to see how this is actually going to manifest.
Do you have live performance as well? Is that the plan at the moment?
We do have a few sort of woven in there. Maybe I can share about Tasha's work. I'll share that. So Tasha Faye Evans is an Indigenous artist here in Vancouver, and she's going to be sharing a solo piece called Cedar Woman, which is something that she has, a piece she's been working on now over the last couple of years, and through some residencies at the Dance Center as well. And Tasha's going to be sharing this work at the Annex live. And whether, we're not sure how many people will be there live, but she will be there performing live. And then, speaking to what I was saying about all the other conversations that are happening, Margaret Grenier and her husband Andrew Grenier, the dancers of Dam Lahamad, will be sharing a talk the day after Cedar Woman, speaking about West Coast dance and the relationship to the visual arts and form lines, and how those form lines in the visual art actually inform some of the movements and the patterns in the dances. And interestingly, Tasha, even though it's in a different form, she did use some of those same kind of principles. And Tasha's also invited Lee Miracle to come and speak the next day too about the origin stories of Cedar Woman. It comes from a traditional teaching here on the West Coast. So I feel like those are two, so it's a live performance, but there's some other elements online too that will complement it. So that's one thing I'm excited about, is seeing that work live. Yes, that's one option. That's one possible option to come and see live. And then maybe, Angela, you have another highlight?
Well, there's nothing
live?
worse than asking a mother to choose between the kids. That's
true.
I think what would I say? Yes, we do have some live performances, and I think what I particularly liked about those offerings is that they're all very unusual. They're not necessarily, with one or two exceptions, they are not for the theatre as you would imagine in a conventional setting, but rather for unusual spaces and an unusual way of engaging with audiences, whether it's durationally or spatially. So perhaps I would mention The Biting School, Arash Kapoor with Orangutan. I think if I speak about it, it will be a spoiler, but perhaps just to say that it is a very interesting take. I think it's got a bit of a comedy. It treats with a sense, a very interesting sense of humor, something that has gone in the last years in all sorts sorts of religious extremist kind of approach. I think all these artists are really putting their bodies on the line in a interesting manner, as in the subjects of the themes of these pieces are not necessarily entertaining or joyous, but they are, again, an invitation to pause and think and engage differently, and perhaps more of a sensorial invitation to really engage with movement and with imagination sensorially, which is something that perhaps we do not think very often of, but probably the pandemic has numbed a little bit how we sense the world. But I think it's something that responds greatly to the sense of disconnect that we have all experienced. And I can speak from a Melbourne perspective, where today or yesterday we became officially the city in the world with the longest lockdown, with the harshest and longest lockdown in the world, over 250 days. So for me, it was really interesting it's the first time that I'm actually curating, but at the same time, I'm in this exercise of imagination, because I can only imagine what these works will become, and I can only imagine what I might feel if I am to imagine those works. So it is a very interesting exercise, but also a very telling proof that dance can operate on so many levels, because in the many conversations I've had with the artists, whether those who are in the program or just conversations with the dance community, I feel that there is something that has been activated corporeally, or a sensation in my body, because when Lee Souffet, who's one of the programmed artists, is talking about dancing from a place of enoughness, or Justine Chambers is telling me about, is that really all we can do in terms of imagination, just to put digitally our works online? Or we've had so many interesting conversations that I feel that I've been with them. I feel like I know how their physicality will unfold, and I almost feel what the audience might experience. It's been a very interesting exercise, and I think also to say that, yes, perhaps the Conversations program, which is really an integral part to this programming, and I'm glad that Starr mentioned it. Yes, it is about embodied performance. There are some works that are digital, or they have been conceived as a digital sensorial experience. So even if you can't see movement, there is a lot of movement that probably will be happening in your mind and filtered through your body. But the Conversations element is also equally important, because they open a space to really... It's an invitation, I think, to contemplate all these many possibilities that dance and its bodies open up. And maybe to just give an example is this keynote conversation. We're not doing keynote speeches, we're doing conversations. And the festival will kick off with this dialogue between Yvette Nolan, who will be in conversation with this incredible Indigenous artist from Australia, Dahlia Pigram, who will be talking about Indigenous dramaturgies, Indigenous ways of being that are not necessarily only about how we are on stage dramaturgically, but how we are in everyday life, and going back to those values of listening and hearing and paying attention to on which lands we stand, which I think is a question that anyone working with dance should consider. Where do your feet stand, and also how do you stand ethically and corporeally in the world? And I think all those invitations are very generously offered, both through the embodied performances and equally through this series of conversations, where I think, we've worked out an amazing lineup of speakers, both from Vancouver and internationally.
That's amazing. So I think that's a wonderful place for us to end this, unless Starr, you'd like to add anything to that, but I think it was a lead.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to be continued from there. Come and see dance.
That's exactly what I wanted to say, that the Dance in Vancouver 2021 is from the 24th to the 28th of November. So keep a lookout. We will reach you all through our many platforms. But I just want to say thank you so much for joining me. That was really wonderful. And I feel quite honored to be part of this journey before I go and engage with the actual event itself. So thank you so much, both of you, Angela Conquet and Starr Muranko. Thank you. And I really look forward to DIV. See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. We would love for you to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts, as this will help other listeners find us and help us to grow our dance audience. We'll be back next month. In the meantime, you can follow us on Facebook at The Dance Centre, Twitter at Dance Centre, and Instagram at The Dance Centre BC. And if you'd like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Just go to our website at thedancecentre.ca, where you'll find extensive information about our upcoming programs and events. The music for the Dance Centre podcast was composed by James B. Maxwell. Always a pleasure to connect with you through dance. Until next time.